Started. Boa tarde a todos e todas. Primeiramente, fazer uma apresentação aqui em português, para logo passarmos as orientações e o início da atividade em inglês, ok? Então, a todos e todas, desejamos um bom evento. Todas as perguntas que eventualmente tiverem, vocês podem fazer em português. Nós vamos ter uma tradutora simultânea, aqui, intérprete profissional. E tentaremos, então, manter do início ao fim o evento em inglês. Como vocês sabem, isso é novo na nossa universidade, são iniciativas que nós estamos tendo com o amparo da gestão central, da Secretaria de Assuntos Internacionais, que é representada pelo professor Júlio Rodrigues, e a Pró-Reitoria de Pós-Graduação em Pesquisa, e o PPG de Relações Internacionais é um dos seus professores que estão aqui presentes, e estudantes, é um dos vanguardistas nessa área que é, obviamente, nossa competência. Então, para iniciarmos, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Igor Castellano. I'm the coordinator of the graduate program on international relations, and today we're going to have the brilliant presence of a foreign visiting professor. We are welcoming him here in Santa Maria, and his name is Peter Christopher Julius Vale, or Peter Vale. He's one of the main professors and scholars from South Africa who deal with international relations theory, international security, foreign policy of global South countries, mainly South Africa and Middle powers. And he's the one of the main references me and other colleagues ever have had in our careers. So for us, it's a pleasure to welcome here Professor Vale. He'll be here in Santa Maria for up to 2 years, we hope, and he's be attached to the graduate program in international relations, as well as the GCAP, the research group on state capacity, security and defense. We don't have an English acronym for that, but GCAP, and we are working a lot together to help our master's program to internationalize its activities, to improve our mobility actions to global South countries, mainly South Africa, but other African countries, India perhaps. And Professor Vale is here to give a generous contribution to that effort. So today we're going to have the 4th meeting of the seminar. We have a seminar series called Research Seminars on International Relations. They are produced and organized by our coordination in the master's program, as well as the students. So I thank very much the students for their help in organizing everything. So thank you very much, guys, and thank you the professors, researchers, and all the community integrated here, as well as the undergrad students that are here, voluntarily, but as well as a matter of their courses they are taking now. So thank you very much for being here. Well, let's talk about Peter. Peter Vale is Senior Research Fellow at the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria. So nowadays he's attached to the University of Pretoria. Peter has been attached to many of the high-level South African universities. He was the founding director of the Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Study, and he is Nelson Mandela Professor of Politics, Emeritus at Rhodes University in the countryside, a very important university in South Africa. Professor Vale has published extensively in a number of fields. These include international relations, Southern African studies, critical security studies, intellectual history, and higher education. He is the recipient of the International Medal, Utrecht University, the Netherlands, amongst other awards. Besides, even though he has this brilliant career and with rich path, he's a very generous man, and he's a brilliant person as well. So take your time and try to interact with him. You don't need to have a brilliant English, fluency. Just try to interact. You're going to see that we can be, very referenced scholars and professors, as well as being a human being and a nice colleague to everybody. So, Professor Peter, thank you very much for being here, and we are looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to start by apologizing that I don't speak Portuguese. Unfortunately, I was born into the English-speaking world, and I said to someone I was born into the family of international relations, because that's the English-speaking world. So I was born into that family. I remembered at lunchtime today that I once had to give a paper at a conference in Porto Alegre. And I was terribly nervous about, as I am today, about the paper I was to give at this conference. Then I had an idea. I had on my computer a recording from AC/DC. And I played the recording from AC/DC instead of giving the lecture. And everybody loved the lecture. And then I said, now what do we learn from this recording of AC/DC? So I'm sorry, I wouldn't have remembered. Had I remembered, I would have played the AC/DC record, and then we could have had a conversation about the importance of AC/DC. I want to start by saying what a great honor and privilege it is for me to be a visiting professor at this great university. I was thinking the other day that this is probably the first time that a South African has ever been elected to a professorship, certainly at this university, and probably at any university in Brazil. So I'll accept that as one of the great honors of my life. Thank you for honoring me in this way. I've also been thinking a lot about starting international relations 50 years ago. And I want to start by saying thank you to these people who've been very helpful in getting me here, who've been looking after me and making sure that I point to the right picture when I'm trying to order food. So I spent a lot of time pointing to food. I also want to thank the people of Brazil and Latin America generally for the gift you gave my country. And this is the gift you gave my country. Every year in the city of Pretoria, we have these flowers blooming. They are called jacarandas in Pretoria and in South Africa, and they come from Brazil and Bolivia and Argentina. And every year, it's as if the people of Latin America and Brazil present South Africa with a gift. I think we forget in international relations that the first part of the field was the exchange of plants. And it's a very interesting historical moment. These plants were planted in the university, in the city of Pretoria in the 1880s and 1890s. And we forget that that was a very rich time in which plants were crossing the world. And it's a form of international relations that anthropologists look at, but also people in the plant field. I also wanted to thank the people of Brazil for sending a South African professor, my first professor of international relations 50 years ago, had spent 10 years in Brazil before he came to South Africa. His name was Mike Lowe. He was a South African. He went to Chicago to study with the great Morgenthau, and then came to Brazil to work for the United Nations, and then came to South Africa where he became a professor of international relations. He wasn't actually here in Santa Maria, but he was in Brasilia before he came to South Africa. So with that as starting, I want also to say that 50 years goes by very quickly. And I can't not imagine that there is somebody in this room who one day in 50 years' time will stand in front of a group of students talking about 50 years of international relations. It happens very fast, so enjoy it while you're having fun. This lecture has taken 3 forms. I published it in a collection of a textbook that is available that people can see. It was also published in this form in another textbook on international relations. But what I've done today is try to change it a little bit and turn it from political narrative into a much more autobiographical piece on 50 years of international relations. Now, I'm getting used to working with an iPad, so please be patient with me. So first, some thoughts before we start. Firstly, we are the products of the discipline. As we make the discipline, it makes us. So we shape the discipline, but the discipline shapes us too. This is not a mechanical relationship. Everything we say and do in international relations, everything we write and policies we advise on and things we do, we are shaping the world. The world is shaping us, but the discipline is also shaping us. So once you are hooked on international relations, you begin to make the world, and the world is making you. And I want to, in a sense, illustrate some of that in these remarks. The second is this very difficult thing that I didn't realize until quite late in my life, that the personal is the political, and the political is personal. I know that there is a branch of school in epistemology and all of these big words that people use that say we should be objective. But I find it very difficult, and I have found it difficult throughout my life, that the personal and the political are not separated. As you make the world makes you, and it's making you in personal ways. And so you have a set of choices to make about the world, and a set of choices about how you live in the world. The third is something that I've realized increasingly as I've gotten older, and it will influence some of my remarks that will emerge today. Why is it that the facts of slavery make more sense than the facts of states? I think we still live with slavery in fundamental ways, in economic, political, and social relationships, but we don't talk about it at all. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to talk, and I will touch on it today, much more in international relations, is the question of slavery. slavery was one of the great outreaches of the world, one of the great international outreaches of the world. And so we can't ignore it. We have to keep thinking about it. It's ever present. And it may be, as I suggest in these remarks, more important than the states. So here's a question. What is the role of international relations as a discipline? Those who know my work a little bit know that I spend a lot of time using cartoons, because I think cartoons tell us a lot about ourselves, our sense of humor, and can illustrate in many ways what it is that we are trying to do. And I love this cartoon because, as you will see, it is two barbarians on a horse, or two Bolsonaro and Lulu on the horse, if you like, and the professor behind it on another horse trying to observe what they are doing. So if politicians are barbarians, then certainly professors of politics will follow them like people on a horse. Or as some people say, the same thing, the relationship between a political scientist and a politician is the same as between a criminologist and a criminal. So you are bound up in these things. So this cartoon here is a cartoon that I always use in my presentations. I want to start a little bit about founding my roots, because each of us come from a set of roots. We are who we are, but we belong in a certain place in the world. You belong in Brazil. If you were born here, you were born here. You were born here. This is the roots. This is the international relations of where I was born. So this here, oh, can't see it. So I was born in South Africa, which is here. But I was born, as this map suggests, in an English world. All that happened at my house was we spoke English, we ate English food, we worshipped in English. It was an English colonial house. And my mother often thought, I think, that we shouldn't be living in Africa at all. We should be living in England at least. Or if not England, we should be living in an empire. We were part of a great empire. And that's the childhood that I had. And that's where I was born into this English family. Before I move on to the next slide, I want to just make a little point. I want to point to these three little islands here. I want you to remember them because I'm going to come back to these islands in a minute. The English have a certain arrogance in the world, and one of the great claims is this arrogance given by a man called Cecil John Rhodes, who played a big role in South Africa. Remember, you're an Englishman and have consequently won first prize in the lottery of life. And I think that this idea of being English and winning first prize in the lottery of life has been one of the central themes in my relationship with international relations from these past 50 years. Thank you. What accounts for this power of the English? What accounts for the power of the English in the world? Well, many things do. They were a rich trading nation. They were a rich nation in terms of what they'd conquered in the world. But the thing that they would basically predicate their power on is the power of killing. And there are 2 points I want to make here in the power of killing. One is technology is ever present in international relations. The technology that you are living through now, that are found on these telephones, the technology that you are experiencing is going to have a profound effect on the international relations that you will live your lives in. In this case, the English power was predicated on a machine gun called the Maxim gun, which allowed them to conquer the world in many places, certainly to conquer Africa, and they did it through killing. And there's no getting away from this. It's time that we faced up to this fact. It's very difficult, I think, in the aftermath of the dying of the English Queen recently, to get away from the fact that essentially English power has reached the end of a certain moment in history. And the English have to come for a reckoning on what has happened. And here, whatever happens is they had the technology to destroy people in the world, particularly non-white people. I was born into a country which had suffered a terrible war. And the war had divided the world into two parts. African people, black indigenous people in South Africa had died in a war that they were not fighting themselves, but had died as products of the war. And Afrikaners who were indigenous. Someone might be coming in the door. Maintenance. I thought it was the English knocking at the door. So black people in South Africa had died as a result of this war, and white people who were not English had also died as a result of this war. And it was into this conflict that this English child was born. And this was the conflict in which the international relationships of these people, particularly around the issue of identity, what we today call identity, began to take shape. We were South Africans because South Africa had been created as a state, but there were different sets of identities emerging. And the emergence of identity politics has a great impact on international relations, I think, and it's something you will have to deal with and think about. These gentlemen here were about your age, living in South Africa. They were called the kindergarten, and these people determined the future of the world. They were a group of Oxford graduates, that word, Oxford graduates. Something going on here. I told you, Oxford is everywhere. They were Oxford graduates living in South Africa in the reconstruction of South Africa. And it was these people who remade the country. And as they remade the country of South Africa, so they began to talk about remaking the world. And as they remade the world, they began to understand the power not only of the English language, but the power of institutions, the power of how to make the world in the interests of the rich and powerful. We could go through a list of these people, but we won't go through it now. I have a book written by a man who's going to give a paper here on the 27th. He and I did a book on this, and we'll talk about that in that book. So I can't understand this because one of the wonderful things I see is that people go and brush their teeth after lunch. I go to the bathroom and see people brushing their teeth. I can't believe the dentist is so close. The point I want to make with this piece of word is that these, and it's very important that you should understand this, that these were men making the world. They were young men making the world. There were no women involved in this conversation at all. They were young men making the world. They were making a white man's burden. So they looked upon the relationship to people who were excluded by their race as a burden on the world. And so that's why I think the race relations in which we are living now, and the race relations which have dominated my own field of international relations, my own relationship with international relations, are so critical. This is an interesting verse. I'll not read it now, but it really says that the burden of white man is to lift black people out of poverty and to try and deal with their stupidity. So influential were this group of young people that they were like anointed, considered themselves anointed to be people who could control the destiny of countries. They made countries and they unmade countries in the English language. And this is a book, a passage from a book in which I'll read it. In the congenial and civilized encounters, they floated ideas in the non-committal school of the Oxford Common Room. They noted each other's expertise and forged lifelong friendships without regard to race or nationality. In these unrecorded discussions, the frontiers were drawn of vast territories. They literally redrew the map of the world. Were assigned to one another jurisdiction. Economic arrangements were devised on seemingly rational principles. So this is the world that I inherited. This is the world that I saw. This is the world into which I was born in the years before I knew that I had been born into it. And here is a piece of discovery that this Vineet Thakur and I have made. We believe, and have argued this in a paper, we believe that the discipline of international relations was born in Johannesburg. The usual story, and I must be very careful because I'm sure people are watching me from other places. The usual story is that international relations as a discipline was born in Aberystwyth in Wales. Our thesis, which challenges the Aberystwyth thesis, is that that was the creation of an academic center, but that people were reconfiguring the world in Johannesburg at the restructuring of the South Africa into which I was born. And that created the world that would eventually grow into the Second World War and what would happen subsequently. So if you want to hear Dr. Thakur talk about international relations in Johannesburg, then do come to that seminar. Why Johannesburg? No, I think probably Igor is the only person who's been to Johannesburg. Anybody been to Johannesburg here? It's not much of a town, is it? But the thing to remember about Johannesburg is that at the time this was going on, it was the richest town, the richest sort of gold mining town in the world. And people were drawn there from all over the world to restructure. British power had come there during the Boer War to restructure the town for the British Empire. Oops, so sorry. Am I going too slowly or too fast? The transition they made was from empire to nation. That's what they were looking for. How to end an empire and build a nation. I just want to stop there and say one thing. It seems to me that we are not done with this conversation about empire. I think that in the next 50 years, as you think about international relations, you're going to have to come back to this question of empire. Because the Russians seem to me, through Putin and others, are thinking about empire. The American empire never went away. There are the Chinese are certainly building an imperial system. So the idea of empire has not gone away. But what these people were doing was trying to move the world from the British Empire into individual nations. So they were creating nations at the same time that there was a conversation going on about the creation of commonwealths. Now listen to what is going on. They're talking about sovereignty in different lives. One life is sovereignty as a state, and the other life is sovereignty as a shared sovereignty and responsibility across the world. And it's that ambiguity, that double meaning of the term of sovereignty has created this double meaning in the word of sovereignty. Sovereignty lives many different lives, but it lives two lives all the time. It has different meanings. And a piece of work that needs to be done is to look at the idea of sovereignty in the context of law, how law creates different meanings in terms of sovereignty. Okay, turn now to making sense of the world through IR and other things. And I want to turn now and talk a little bit about my own experience of growing up and early international relations. So what was going on is that these are two white people standing at a fence. The interesting thing about the fence for you to note in the cartoon is that it's a barbed wire fence. So it has a certain security dimension to it, an added sense of security to the barbed wire fence. So they were both making empire and securing sovereignty at the same time. These two processes were going on at the same time. And this happened between South Africa and a country that is next door to us called Zimbabwe. It was called Rhodesia. And often an anecdote will tell you a story much better than a piece of analysis will tell you a story. When I was a child, I won't tell you how many years ago, you can work that out yourself. When I was a child, you could go from South Africa to the state called Zimbabwe now, or Rhodesia, and spend without a passport. You would go up to a hut, you would go up to a cabin, and a guy would look out from the cabin at you at your car and say, "Where are you going?" You'd say, "I'm going to do some hunting." So you can imagine the border between here and Uruguay. "Oh, I'm just going hunting for a little bit in the hills nearby." "Oh, that's great. When you come back, bring us some meat." That was a border. That was a border. That was a border. This is 50 years ago. That was a border. Today, it takes about 5 days to cross the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe. Now, here's something for you to think about. Is this sovereignty? Is this security? Or are people trapped there for economic reasons? It's a growth industry. People are selling cakes and cookies and Coca-Cola and coffee and everything else at the border. So the border is an industry. And I think one of the things that you're going to have to think about in international relations more and more is the fact that an industry has grown up around borders. My colleagues here will know that I had a very difficult time getting the necessary papers to come from South Africa to Brazil. Not because I'm a bad guy, okay, because I'm a bad guy too, but because it's an industry. because I had to get a document from this person, I had to get a document from that person, I had to get a document from that person. It's an industry. And this industry, my friends, is never going away. This is people's jobs, their livelihoods, their pensions, everything. This industry is never going away. You can talk about regional integration from now until the cows come home. This industry is never going away. So that's something that's happened fundamentally in the last 50 years. Oh, sorry, I have to. South Africa fought in 2 wars against the Germans, 2 European wars. But they fought alongside these other countries that you will see here. Britain, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and India. They fought in an alliance against the Germans, but as a commonwealth. And this idea of the Commonwealth is a paper that I'm supposed to be writing. The British Commonwealth was part of Britain's answer to the world, said to be the most innovative international idea of all time. But it's largely the fact now that I think the Commonwealth is dead. But South Africa fought these wars on the side of the Commonwealth. So how did this idea begin? How did this idea of sovereignty begin? Where did the international specializations begin? And here I'm going to turn to one of my favorite subjects, the subject of how knowledge is created, the sociology of knowledge. And I'll start with a quote from the European statesman Jean Monnet. Nothing is possible without men. Nothing is lasting without institutions. So if you want these things to survive, if you want ideas to survive, if you think an idea is a good idea, you have to build an institution. And so to foster the idea both of the Commonwealth and sovereign independent states, they set up institutes of international affairs. Now, I find it difficult to say this to you, but I'm going to say it from my heart. Always ask a think tank where the money is coming from. I'm going to say that again, because you're all going to ask for jobs in think tanks. Ask where the money is coming from. Let me say it again. Ask where the money is coming from. Think tanks find it very difficult to exist without money. And with the establishment of these institutes of international affairs where I worked for many years, I also worked for an Institute for Strategic Studies in London for many years. They have interests, and these interests are fundamental. And these interests create a kind of epistemic community, an epistemic group of people thinking in the same way. So what happened is that in the British sense, there was this creation of think tanks. And this is a little book I did with Alex Davis, Vineet Thacker, and myself on the discovery and plantation of institutes of international affairs across the Commonwealth. These were early prototype think tanks. And here is a think tank, Johannesburg. I want you to notice about it. This is in Africa. Eh? This is in Africa. I want you to notice the classical architecture. So it's not an African architecture. It's an architecture which takes you back to Rome and to Greece, and assures you that what has happened is that the knowledge that is ingrained in that has been from that time onwards. This is an Institute of International Affairs, a memorial to a white statesman in classical style of architecture. And in a version of this paper that I'm talking about, I make the point that black people worked in this Institute of International Affairs, but not as staff, not as professional staff, but served the tea. So white people were talking about black people. They were serving the tea, black people, but they had no voice in what was going on. Now, the Institute has changed, let me be clear. I had a very unhappy time there, but it was the kind of systematic exclusion of people which becomes so embedded in forms of international relations. And here is one of my favorite quotes of all time. If you have nothing else to do in the coming holidays, take Hannah Arendt and go and sit under a bush and read Hannah Arendt. And I'm going to quote the quote to you because it's about thinking and think tanks. There are few things more frightening than the steadily increasing prestige of scientifically minded brain trusters in the Council of Government in the last decades. The trouble is not that they are cold-blooded enough to think the unthinkable, but they don't think. And my advice to you is, and forgive me for passing on advice, my advice to you is every time you see an expert on the television, on CNN or other television service, just think a little bit about, is this person really thinking of this thing through, or are they just passing on information? It's difficult, I know, because media and social media has played this incredibly important role. So now I'm going to turn to political interludes and other pastimes. My own life's work has been caught up in fundamentally this issue of race and international relations. So 50 years of it has been trying to struggle with this thing. This is a cartoon. This guy here is a sketch cartoon. The country which first brought South Africa's treatment of people of color to the attention of the international community was India. India became independent, as you know, in 1947. And in 1947, South Africa went to the United Nations conference in San Francisco and were lambasted for the treatment of people of Indian background. This is a very funny cartoon, I think, done by an American cartoonist who lived in South Africa. As you'll see, I'm very close to these cartoonists, often much more close to the cartoonists than I am to the English school. The second cartoon is the cartoon of political isolation. South Africa became, like North Korea, one of the most isolated states in the world because of race. And this is a cartoon, as you can see, of the Prime Minister, then Dr. Verwoerd, not a very nice man, sitting in the middle of the ocean on a skunk, with a skunk on a raft. And he's saying, "You still have me." So this, my early work, and I quote here from an early piece of work I did. My early work was on really trying to understand South Africa's isolation in international relations. Here's a paper I wrote, probably the first paper I ever had published in 1977, called South Africa as a Pariah International State. Looking at South Africa's isolation in the world. If you think about it, this is completely counterintuitive to globalization. Globalization is the incorporation of everybody into an international system. This was South Africa as an isolated state, excluding state. And it became, I'm afraid to say, quite a difficult paper to live with, because this one and the guy above me who got the other paper, my friend Dion Geldenhuys and I, were quoted in the front page of the local newspaper for calling South Africa an isolated state. But this was my early work, was on this idea of isolated states. What ended South Africa's isolation was paradoxically the Cold War, because as the Cold War ended, South Africa's isolation ended with the end of the Cold War. And this cartoon here is a cartoon of a very well-known person from the Caribbean. You may or may not remember him as, this could be Che or it could be Fidel. Choose which one you want it to be. Arriving to help the freedom of Africa, South Africa. And there's absolutely no question that the war fought in your sister country, Angola, was the war that made the difference in Southern Africa. South Africa lost the war in Angola, and so that helped end apartheid in South Africa. This is a book I did with a friend called Gary Baines on Beyond the Board of War, how people continued to live their lives beyond bordered wars. And we often forget that when war takes place, and this is going to happen now in this Chinese experiment, this Russian experiment, is that it's not simply going to be the men that go fighting, it's going to be the legacy of the war afterwards, 50 or 60 or 70 years of legacy that will exist after the war, because that's what wars are about. My father's generation were people who fought in the war. Some of them never forgot the war. And there's something about international relations that is unable to take that dimension on. Towards the end of apartheid, I was working on trying to influence American foreign policy towards South Africa. And this was a paper I wrote in the American publication journal called Foreign Affairs, called on constructive engagement. What was America's policy on constructive engagement? And I think, just as a little side story, that we need to capture these American journals and make them our own, because Americans believe that they can control the world, partially because they have access to these journals. So this is the kind of work that I was doing, from isolation to studies of war and the region in the war to influencing American policy. Well, of course, apartheid ended. South Africa went to vote. I'm sure you know who this gentleman is here. This is Mr. Mandela, with South Africa, the day of the election. This is a cartoon drawn by South Africa's best-known cartoonist, Jonathan Zapiro, done on that day. This is my favorite Zapiro cartoon, probably my favorite cartoon of all the world, because you'll see the picture of them in London together, Mandela and the late Queen sitting in the carriage, and the policeman says to one policeman says to the other, "The next bloody tourist who asks me who's the little old lady with Mandela." But I think that this is a symbolically important moment, because I think what has happened is that if fashion, if culture, if these other dimensions in which we ruled the world came from Britain and Europe and the United States, I think we're now in a world in which different categories are playing into this. Let me give you one example. This K-hop that comes out of Korea, it's an incredibly influential form of music. And I think the music that comes out of Brazil, which I hope someone's going to help me understand a little bit or send me some free records to listen to, this is the cultural trend that is being set. It's no longer coming out of the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. It's now a whole different. This is the world culture in which you are going to have to live your international relations. Be aware of one thing. Culture and international relations are intimately tied up together in quite fundamental ways, and you should understand that if you're going to try and make progress in this field. This little sad cartoon is we're now thinking, what was apartheid all about? Of course, it wasn't just trash. It was in the debris of trash that everything else has emerged. South Africa remains a very racially divided country in which identity politics continues to play this enormously powerful role. South Africa's international relations are still tied up in conversations about race. Here's an example. The South African government's position on the Ukraine war has been largely pro-Russian. The South African think tanks on the Ukraine war have been largely pro-Western. So this is a deeply divided situation, and it's divided fundamentally along the lines of race. So when I wrote the paper to this point, I began to think about what international relations is and what is it trying to do, that I had with one of my first slides. So I went to Oxford to see my child, who was a student there. And I had always wanted to go to a field in Oxford where they had run a mile, the fastest mile, the only mile in the world. You know, a mile is a distance. I don't know, do you work in miles or kilometers here? 2.2 kilometers, okay. So I'd always, as a child, wanted to go to this field because I'd been very influenced by this picture. This picture is a picture sent to my school from London when I was a child, when my mother was telling me we should belong to England. This picture arrived at my school of this athlete, Roger Bannister, who was quite a famous, he was a medical doctor, including a few other things. But he ran this measured mile in the fastest time. He broke 4 minutes. So I'd always wanted to go to the field. So I went one morning early, listening to Leonard Cohen, to this field at Oxford. And I walked around this field because I'd always been interested in athletics and had done a little bit of running myself. I went to this field, and then it suddenly struck me that what had happened at that field was a quintessential moment of modernity. They had taken space and they had tried to give it a time. And this is one of the great philosophical debates in physics. So they had tried to take space and give it a time. And that's what they had done. They had captured space and given it a time. But there were massive problems in this. And here are some of the problems in it. It was unlikely that this was the first time in history, ever, since the beginning of time, that someone had run a mile in a minute, in 4 minutes. Could it be possible? How would you know that? You wouldn't know that. But what you were able to do is you were able to capture this idea and broadcast it to the world, claim to the world that this had happened. Was he the first or was he proclaimed? You were bringing space and time under, you were bringing space under the control of time. So here is the key to the issue. Who gets to speak on these matters? Who gets to speak on these matters? Who has the authority of saying these things? Firstly, it's like these guys who are dividing the world up into countries. They came from Oxford. They were professional people. They got the privilege of speaking. They declared history by saying it. And I'm sure you've done the Speech Act. Have you done the Speech Act? When in security studies, when you securitize something, you give a Speech Act. You say, this is a security crisis. It's an act you're giving. You're making an act. You're pronouncing an act from a pulpit. So they were giving this authority of the act. And you were settling contestations by claiming it as a truth. And I think international relations does that about the world. It takes ungoverned spaces and it declares them governed by time and people. That's what I think international relations does. So in terms of the 4-minute mile, that's what it does. IR brings space through the idea of sovereignty under the control of modernity, brings it to discipline. And what you are seeing going on in the Amazon rainforest is this question of trying to bring ungoverned spaces under control of modernity. It abolishes anarchy. It assumes that if you have no control, it's anarchical. It purportedly establishes order. It creates a sense of order. It polices any deviance from that is controlled. And it promises this in the name of progress. Now, this is not a fundamental breakthrough. This is not a fundamental breakthrough. But what it is a little game you can play in international relations with imagination by comparing international relations with different things. So you must play games in your head and try and think of international relations in different ways. And that's what I think it does. So in a few more slides, I want to do a few things. Remember I showed you this little island here. This little island here was an ungoverned idyllic island until the British conquered it. They kept it as part of the British colonies. And in 1965, they gave it to the United States. Listen to this. They gave it to the United States. The United States wanted it because there was troubles brewing in the Middle East. And so it became a fundamental Cold War problem. They gave it to the United States. They displaced thousands of people. They displaced thousands. They kicked thousands of people off the islands. And they said, I tell you what, we'll send you to a neighboring island. The neighboring islands were here. So in the middle of the ocean, it's not moving house from here to next door. It's moving thousands of kilometers away. It was an important base in the Cold War. It remains an important base for the United States. The plight of the islanders has only restarted. International relations, I'm sorry to say, has been largely uninterested in this problem. This is a problem of justice. This is a problem not of security studies, but of justice. What is now emerging is an increasingly vociferous campaign across the world about justice for these people. How are they going to live in the future since they lost their island 50 years ago? So it seems to me that the central tension, oh my goodness. Oh, there you are. You saw The central tension in international relations remains facts about the world and our place in it, or values about the world and our place in it. That remains the central tension in international relations. That remains the challenge for the next 50 years, as it certainly was a challenge in the 50 years in which I was involved in it. Let me just use 2 more minutes to say 2 things. It seems to me international relations is developing in a certain way. There are tribes in international relations. We're still difficult between peacemakers and war makers, between the realists and the English school, between constructivists, between Marxists. Then there are Marxists in international relations. Air travel has helped us narrow these gaps between us, or has exacerbated these gaps. The conference workshop remains the model to do this. Academic publications and social media are important. Technology, as I said in the beginning, seems to me to be the most important question. And it's having an important not only in the way we understand it, we communicate it, but the way in which it is practiced. I mean, the blowing up of this bridge in Crimea is a fact of technology. And it's going to have major implications for how we approach war issues. And then I think there is something else, and that is we need to find innovative forms of cooperation to get international relations people together in the future. And those are the passages which you are going to have to walk in the next 50 years. So when I finished the paper, I wrote this conclusion, and I hope you'll forgive me if I read it to you. A paradox stalks international relations. As it obsesses over peacemaking, the principle of sovereignty, which is at the center of its worldview, looks upon a messy, often violent social relationships. There are no uncontaminated spaces in the making and remaking of these social relationships. There is no space where IR can escape the hot breath of compromise, concession, conciliation. However, the task which lies beyond is to recognize, despite all we are taught, this is a largely unexplored world. Let me repeat that. It's a largely unexplored world, but it remains a place of infinite possibilities and a site of great hope. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. Please take your seat. And now, let's the discussion begin. If you want to be here with me. No. Perfect. Thanks very much for your talk. Your brilliant ideas have been touching us since you arrived here. So we've been discussing a lot in master's degree courses, and we are very touched by the innovative ideas that you bring into the analyzing of international relations field and the international relations dynamics. So before I have some comments to your presentation, I would like to ask people to request our staff here if you have some questions or thoughts regarding the presentation. So anytime you have a question, please hold your hand up, and Luis is going to take the microphone to you, okay? Is that all right, Luisa? Okay. Oh, so Luisa Witzel. We have two Luisas, actually three Luisas now. So that's okay. So does anybody have a question now, or you want me to start? Everybody's frozen now. Okay, no problem. So Peter, you mentioned many aspects of international relations, and that's a very particular way of reading international relations with your own personal history and professional history. So the paper is a teaching essay that help us to understand how to look to international relations and to look to ourselves as well. So this is not common in Brazil, because we are very attached to mainstream international relations field, and the development of Brazilian international relations is too much attached to the North American concept of observation. So you mentioned before the idea of observation. So, and that's very interesting how the deconstruction of the idea of, separation between analysts, subjects, and objects can create new points of view of international relations that you can see international relations throughout everywhere. So I just wanted to, in the beginning, to understand how your decision of start studying international relations through new lenses provoked difficulties in your research career. For example, when you decided to look through border war in Southern Africa, did you experience difficulties to produce new ways of understanding international relations when you went to cartoons? Because you had a time, you spent a long time in SAIA Institute. And as I read, your work in SAIA Institute was more directed to international security studies and more material perspective. I wanted to understand your turning to this more idealistic approach and the difficulties maybe you've experienced with that.
Thanks. What I try to do in the paper is to say that this thing lives with you and you live in it. how can you separate that and be objective about it? How can you be objective about it? And this gets to the meat of your question. When people you know go to jail, how can you be objective about it when it becomes quite clear to you that South Africa is fighting a war in the border of its neighborhood, and everybody is denying that this is happening? You can't deny this. You see this stuff for what it is. And you say to yourself, well, I can pretend that I don't see it. I can pretend that I must give this one's opinion on the one hand and on the other hand, etc., etc., etc. But it becomes so deeply embedded. And one's own personal politics become involved in this situation. I mean, I played a tiny little role in politics. My wife was in much more trouble than I was in, but I spent a year without a passport. They took my passport away. My wife spent 4 months in jail for just supporting education of children. So it gets very difficult in those situations to say, hey, hang on, let's be objective about this. You can't do that. And then I was driven to this moment intellectually by critical security studies, which I began to think about when apartheid ended. And through my relationship with critical security studies at the Aberystwyth School. So I began to move more and more and more to this direction. So I don't think you can be objective about these things. It doesn't make me a terrorist. If anything, I'm a humanist, which is a very soft thing. But you just can't have this. How can you be objective if children are starving in the street outside? Maybe someone else can be. If you're a statistician and you like statistics and economics, you can be like that. That's not me. So that's not too personal.
Anybody? Good. Gideon. Thank you. Please don't be shy.
Hello, Professor. I would like to know, you mentioned the Russians and all the thing happening in the Crimea bridge, but I really want to talk about how the BRICS fits into this, like Brazil, Russia, China, and South Africa. Now that I know that the South African government is very pro-Russian, and here in Brazil we have kind of a neutrality towards the conflict, and China have this scheme with the Russians. I would like to know how this idea of BRICS, like those countries that are going to shape in the world, how is there a perspective on that or something like that? Thank you.
I'm sad about BRICS. I thought it was a really good idea. It was a good idea because it did give countries, medium ranking countries, some stronger, much stronger than others, but it did give them a voice. But if you think about the idea of BRICS, it came out of was it the London or the New York Stock Exchange? as a way of bundling countries together. As a way of bundling countries together, medium developed countries together. I always thought South Africa was lucky to be in BRICS. But if I was a betting person, I wouldn't put too much money on BRICS surviving now. I think probably BRICS is finished in some form or another. I think that as authoritarian governments take over in China and in Russia, they're not going to be very interested in BRICS. And I don't think, well, Lula, of course, was very keen on BRICS, but he had a much more open idea about foreign policy. But I have no idea what Mr. Bolsonaro's ideas on foreign policy are. So I'm sorry to say, but BRICS are off the table.
Anybody else? Another one over there.
Hello, Professor. So I apologize, I'm going to put two questions together for me. So you mentioned a more humane approach to international relations, bringing more the cultural side of things. So I would like to ask, in your opinion, could we say that imperialism is not actually dead and the empire has not actually given space to sovereignty of the nations, but taken a more subtle role and approaching itself in the form of culture?
Is that the first or the second question? It could be both. I mean, I do think that there is a competition for cultural power. And the competition for cultural power is really around the English language, which is the fundamental dominating power of culture. And I think here we have a conversation, we all have to have a conversation in the world. And the conversation has to be, does English belong to the Americans, the Canadians, the Australians, my mother, or does English belong to everybody? And I think that's a conversation we're going to have. English is a language which is used in many places, and it has variations of English. I spent some time in Singapore. They speak a language called Slinglish there. So it will adapt. My own view of the English language is that it's a very hierarchical language, structured in hierarchy and class terms. If you're English, you are on top of the world. Everyone else is second or third. It jokes about other people in other countries. So I'm very keen on it. So if we're going to undercut English, we've got to turn it into our language, the language of the ruling classes of the world. By the way, I think this thing that's going on in Britain now, the real crisis of legitimacy of language and culture. It's such a fundamental thing because it's not only politics, but it's the family, it's the end of the Commonwealth, it's all of these kind of things happening at the same time. We are seeing the end of an empire of 200 years, 300 years happen before our eyes. It's even more impressive, I think, than this collapse of Putin.
Great. Please, guys, remember that you can make questions in Portuguese as well, so don't worry, Lisa.
Hi, Peter. How are you? I have a question for you. You talked about the role of technology, and you said technology is the most important part in the process of creating a new field of international relations. how do you see the role of technology? What role is technology playing in your country? Because we see micro communities here, we see culture being preserved through technology. Do you think this is a movement that also happens in South Africa? Do you think that we're gonna see a new jump in technology in the field of international relations? Or do you think it is already in progress? Also, great lecture. Love you.
Look, technology is already playing this enormous role. If you think about the colonization of Mars, I mean, this is a technological breakthrough. This is international relations on a scale we never envisaged during the Cold War. I mean, we're going back to the moon after, what is it now, 50 years? So this is completely changing it, but it's also changing it at the micro level. I have a son who's a lawyer, and he's a technology lawyer. And I mean, we don't even speak the same language to each other anymore. I mean, we talk about each other's friendship and love and stuff like that. But he's in another technological framing. And I'm not qualified to talk on those terms. So, but I also think it's enormously influential in, as we now know, artificial intelligence is playing a big role in the capturing of terrorists. All of these things are happening at the same time. So I don't think we can control technology. Technology will control us. I mean, technology, to be frank, I'm very impressed with technology in Brazil, even though I'm very primitive at it. I think it's of a higher level than it is in South Africa, but I'm not qualified to speak about it. I mean, what it might do, and it might affect the teaching of international relations, is that some guy is going to launch a course on artificial intelligence and IR. You can bet your life that's going to happen. Good luck with examining that.
Great. I take a chance as well to bring another question. Let's just see what time it is. 3:33. Okay. Peter, as you showed us in your lecture as well as in your papers and publications, you're not quietly attached to a specific theoretical research program or either a methodological research line or cage. But at the same time, you mentioned several times the School of Critical Security Studies, as well as in other occasions, you mentioned decolonization, post-colonial studies as well. And I wanted to bring a question to you regarding that, because you are a Global South researcher living in a Global South country. And this is quite unusual for post-colonial theoretical, or researchers or professors. So usually post-colonialism or decolonization or decolonial studies are being produced by people that they are living in North countries, in Western countries, in great cities, in huge universities with high level of funding. but you are not. So how do you see post-colonial studies by your perspective? Because we've been learning post-colonial studies from the perspective of, researchers or intellectuals that produce in the North universities or Western universities. And the thing you mentioned here before, that you need to, when you see injustice, you see violence in your day-to-day routine, you cannot be silenced, or you cannot be quiet about that. So we need to be post-colonial in a sense when you live in a global South country. So I wanted to hear about one or two things about that from you, because this is a quite unusual experience, at least in English-speaking community, academic community. And finally, post-colonial studies, as any critical study, any critical research, any critical science, needs to think about real world, so politics and so on. But as you know, we have in third world or second world, we have a problem of analyzing global South, of living in the global South. Since you are living in the global South, we are living in a global South country, but as well as governing global South. And in that point, many post-colonial theoretics or intellectuals, they decided to have a very, traditional way of governing global South countries. And at this point, I think there is not much produced about how to govern global South countries. And beyond the idea of sovereignty, beyond the idea of, producing more state capacity in the same way old closed autocratic regimes have produced. So what do you think about that? How big is our task of trying to understand how to govern global South countries in a sense that is more just, we produce more justice and less violence?
It seems to me your question has three bits to it. One is that decolonization scholars are living in the global North. I think that in a sense has opened up the global North to being much more open-minded about understanding fundamental issues like race and gender and these kind of questions. And I think that's been a good thing. So that's been a good thing. There is such fantastic writing in the global South that we don't really know about and won't exchange ideas about. But let's go back to BRICS. Wouldn't it be fantastic to open a BRICS library? Because some of the most interesting writing about the nature of countries of the global South are in India. Who's ever heard of the work of the Indian intellectual, psychologist, writer, critical theorist, Ashish Nandi? This is amongst the most interesting work I've ever read. So here's an idea. Let's start a library of global South writers that are interesting stuff. My friend Dilip Menon who's a professor of international relations, but comes to it through Indian history, has just done a book on theory and the global south. There's something else that's interesting. Living and reforming the global south is the most difficult part of your question. What concerns me more than anything else is the lack of leadership. What concerns me most is that young people do not choose politics as a career because it's too dangerous, it's too destructive, saps your soul, destroys your ambition. I don't know enough about Brazil, but is there anyone who is 40 years old who you could say could run Brazil? This is what you've got to think about. Where are the 40-year-olds in the room? I can't think of one person in my country who's 40 or 45-year-old who I could say this person can run the country, man or woman. Those are the people we have to think about. Because those are the people who are going to have to deal not only with the climate problem, the poverty problem, and these multiple things that are upon us. I mean, can you believe that the two guys who fought for the American presidency last time, right, were older than me? It's like the joke they used to tell about two bald men fighting for a comb. If you have good hair, you have no hair, why are two bald men fighting for a comb? That's what it's like. So you've got to find young people who are willing to be leaders. And this takes courage, sacrifice, intelligence, confidence, and a belief that the world is reformable, and the belief that the world is a good place to be and a good place in which to live. But it's not going to be easy, because I can't think of any young person, maybe Zelensky's the exception, who is able to do this. Where can you find Zelensky? Hasn't this guy who is in South America, in Central America, I've forgotten the country. This guy's main interest is in digital coins. What is his name? This guy in Central America who's put his country onto digital coins. What is his name? Anyway, you're too far away from Central America. You have to have faith. You have to have faith in yourself, in your own leadership, because no one else is going to lead you out of this. You have to lead yourself. Good luck.
Well, guys, does anybody have more questions? No? 2 more questions? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so let's make it 4 questions, okay? Let's try to... So let's start with the people from this YouTube chat meeting, okay? Because we are high technological people. Yeah.
Yeah.
They can make questions as well. So go ahead, please.
So I'm going to read the questions they've sent to us. So the first question was sent by Muriel, who is also a graduate student here. And she asked, Professor Peter, in the beginning of your lecture, you said that to understand IR, we need to look at slavery. In addition, we can say that race is fundamental to understand IR as well. But unfortunately, we know that IR school is still blind to racism and race issues in international politics. So in your opinion, how can we bring race to the center of discussions in contemporary IR?
So I think the work that Thacker and other people have done on race is bringing it to important, the decolonization of race. This is a growing field in IR, and it's an exciting field, and it's an important field, and needs to be taken seriously. And it has to start with slavery. I mean, we can't pretend that slavery didn't happen.
Okay, and we've got one more question that was sent from Fernanda, who is also a graduate student. And she asks, how do you understand the urban segregation in South Africa? As in, people with different identities live in different urban zones. And then she asks, what is its impact in IR theory? Or maybe how can IR theory explain this?
I mean, if you think about IR theory, it deals with separation into states. I mean, I think there's a book to be written on IR theory in South Africa, because what the South African state, the apartheid state, tried to do was create separate states. So separation became a big issue in South Africa. I mean, what we have, and this shifts the question slightly, what we have is a continuation of race discrimination. South Africa remains a racially mixed country and racially separated country. And many of the struggles in South Africa are fought over the proxy of race. But it also shows you that the legacy of these conflicts remains in place for a long, long time. You know, end of the Cold War, we thought it was all over. Francis Fukuyama, we're all right up to the sunset to be happy people. Mr. Putin wasn't happy. So these things remain embedded in the system for a long time, sometimes for centuries.
Hi, Peter. So, as someone who was raised in this context of yours, I imagine you had a lot of experience regarding the apartheid regime. So, I really wanted to know, how do you see like the changes that was made in your country in these 2 past decades, and what are your hopes for the future? For the nearby future regarding this?
Hello, Peter. You said something during your lecture that made me curious a little bit, and I would like you to develop on it if you can. It sounded to me that you claim a different place and time of birth of international relations, not as a field of study, but as a practice in the case of South African nation craft. And I really like to hear a little bit more about it.
Hey, in your article, you mentioned thought crime, and I feel like in George Orwell's book, 1984, the author also puts up the barriers between language and revolution. And I would like to know, in your opinion, do you see English being used as a globalized language as a barrier to multiple thoughts and opinions, or do you see it as something that can contribute to globalization and ending imperialist roots in IR? Hello, Professor. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you here. My question may be a little bit personal. I don't know. Feel free to not to answer if you don't want to. But I'd like to know, how is it to grow in and develop in your theories and your point of view, considering the context you told us a little bit, and you also told on your lecture. And by that I say, considering the context, you said you had your passport taken for 1 year, your wife was arrested. How was it? And in addition, I'd like to know, how is it? How do you feel looking back in time, 15 years in time, and seeing all you've been through, all the everything you've done, everything you searched and everything you studied? How is it? How is it like? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Just finish those answers now, and then see if we can have a new last round.
Let me take the first and the last one together. Apartheid was morally and politically a disaster. It sapped the energies of people, and it is absolutely indefensible that this had to happen. But it was also indefensible that English people stood by and allowed this to happen and pretended that they weren't responsible for what happened. So, whereas the brunt of the power and the accusation has been against Afrikaners, white Afrikaners, for what happened, English-speaking South Africans have got away with literally murder. And I think that's something that still has to be discussed. You need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is, by the way, an interesting idea, but not a permanent idea, for English speakers to deal with their own role in what happened. They pretended to be part of a global class and benefited from apartheid, and now continue to live off the fat of the land. I mean, basically, South Africa's political and economic position remains one of white wealth and black poverty. That's what the basic problem is, white wealth and black poverty. I have absolutely no doubt that the fortunate tiny little bit that I was able to play in ending this thing, and it was infinite. Mandela went to prison for 27 years. I had my passport taken away for a month. I mean, what comparison is that? It was absolutely the right thing for me to do. It was a badge of courage that the government gave me. Thank you for that. I would not make any of those choices again. I mean, I would not hesitate for a second to make those choices again. They were the right choices to be made for my life and for my professional life. And I was just blessed to allow this to happen. English domination of the world. I think that we have to have a negotiation with English. But let me say this also, which is really important. If you can't speak 2 or 3 languages, your life is absolutely impoverished. You cannot understand the world if you can only speak 1 language. And I'm sure that people here speak 2 or 3 languages: Spanish, Portuguese, English. I'm blessed to be able to speak 2 English and Afrikaans quite well and have a smattering of 3rd language. So if I have a piece of advice for you studying international relations, learn as many languages as you can. because that's going to help you. But we will continue to negotiate with English from now and forever, because it's become such a dominant language, such a cultural, powerful language. But start listening to K-hop and send some music of Brazilian music. Do some interesting things. Don't only buy the music out of London. Ed Sheeran. Okay.
Okay, we had just the last one on the nation threat of the Union of South Africa and making all that relations.
Look, what happened was there was an attempt here to they were doing three things, this group of white men. They had learned how to publish in journals. They were doing peer review, and they were doing also meetings. So it was a prototype of international relations discipline that were going on. They took this and introduced it to the world. So it was a kind of prior international relations. This is not what the people at Aberystwyth want to hear, because I think it was international relations. But it was a pre-international relations system that they were developing.
Very good. So Peter, thanks very much. I think our time is over now, and I just wanted to thank you again and say how we are much obliged and we appreciate a lot your lecture, your insights, your teachings this afternoon. We invite you to be with us more time and to discuss international relations, to be patient with our level of discussion, and also give us some of your time. So thank you very much for being here, for being with us, and thank you guys as well for being here, for taking your time this afternoon. I believe that all of you has seen that we have a very important opportunity here to understand different views on international relations and different experiences, as well as different paths to how to create a career that is not just creating a career, it's creating international relations as well. So bear this in mind, and I believe Peter has a message of hope in our field, despite the fact that the history of international relations is a history of injustice. There's still space for hope and for us doing our jobs, maybe not bearing the white man's burden, but bearing our own idea of what's justice in this world. So thank you guys for being here, and we see you the other time. So let's go back to class. Let's have an interval. My class is going to be back in the room next door here. Okay, so 20 to 30 minutes, okay, of break, and you coming back again. Thank you very much, guys. See you again. Thank you, Peter.